Good morning, Earth Science, and welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Chapter 22, which is all about Earth's oceans and the study of oceanography. Remember that there's four kind of uh, disciplines of Earth science: meteorology, geology, uh, astronomy, and then oceanography. And oceanography is all about the oceans. So oceanography is an important field of Earth science because there's 70% of Earth that is covered by ocean. So getting to know more about it is important. Oceanography is the scientific study of the ocean using chemistry, biology, physics, geology, and other sciences to kind of quantify data and look at trends over time. So the first kind of oceanography thing that we saw was using logbooks to compile charts of both ocean winds and the currents that were happening. This happened with Matthew F. Maury, who was a U.S. naval officer. In 1855, he published this book over here on the right, The Physical Geography of the Sea. And this was the first kind of time we saw somebody had taken track of this data over time and was looking at trends in it. So an important ship was the H.M.S. Challenger. A kind of artist rendition of the voyage is depicted here. But it was the first large-scale ocean research project. And there was lab equipment over this. Researchers lived on the ship for over 4 years. They measured ocean depth, they took water samples, they recorded temperatures, studied the currents. And then after World War II, we had lots of advancements in developed submarines, and we had better ships on the surface, we had sonar, and we had magnetic recorders. And all of these things together allowed us just to get a bigger picture of what the ocean looked like underneath the surface. So some modern research tools include things like robotic exploration vehicles, things that are like deep sea cores. We get really deep sediment samples off the bottom of the ocean. Sonar, which we use to measure ocean depth, and then things like this deep submersible vehicle named Alvin here. And there's this picture. And this was a three-man crew could fit aboard this. It explored deep sea trenches. It went and looked at hydrothermal vents, and even the wreck of the Titanic. So very cool kind of vehicle to go do this with. The next part of this chapter kind of deals with the properties of water, the first one being density. The density of any substance is the ratio of its mass over its volume. So it depends on kind of two things, the physical state of a structure and then the substance's temperature. Usually things become more dense when they change from a liquid into a solid, but so things like iron, usually as it becomes a solid, it becomes more dense and it will sink inside of liquid iron. But water itself is a little unique. The solid is less dense and will actually float on top of the liquid. And you can see that here, this ice is floating on top of liquid water. So liquid water at 4 degrees Celsius is right around 1.0 grams per centimeters cubed. That's that mass per volume. At 0 degrees Celsius, it is 0.92 grams per centimeter cubed. So it's just lighter than itself. So it's able to float on top there. So why is ice less dense? This is because in ice, the water molecules are spread apart in a rigid framework, which has more space in it than water does. So it has more air, so it allows it to be less dense. But also happens, and it's really important that as it does this, it expands. And this is what happens when you leave your water bottle or a soda in the freezer and it explodes, or during the cold months when this ice is making the highway expand and it can cause cracking like this on this picture here, this pothole to form. Water also has a certain polarity to it, a certain charge to it. So we just a little review here. We've got one oxygen molecule in water that's attached to two hydrogen atoms. Because of this, the oxygen atom ends up being slightly negative and the hydrogen atoms become slightly positive. And this molecule is now polar. And this is this uneven distribution of charge between the molecule's ends, where one end is more negative and one end of the molecule is more positive. Because of this, we see things like hydrogen bonding in water. And hydrogen bonding is the attraction that happens between a positively charged hydrogen atom and a negatively charged atom of another molecule. In this case, it's going to be oxygen. But there is hydrogen bonding that happens with nitrogen and other kind of negative species. So this hydrogen bonding makes the connections between water molecules. These dotted lines are hydrogen bonds here because they're not connected by like covalent bonds like these guys are that have the solid lines. They're connected by hydrogen bonds. In order for water to change from a liquid to a gas, we have to break these hydrogen bonds so that that water molecule can fly off free as steam. So what this means is water's boiling point is higher than similarly sized particles that don't have this hydrogen bonding. So we have to use more heat to break things free in water, which is good because we're made out of a lot of water, so it's nice that it's stable. All right, so solutions of water. Anytime we say solution, we mean two things that are mixed together. And when we say aqueous solutions, aqueous, this is when we have salt or something else dissolved inside of water. Water makes aqueous solutions. Think agua. When we have solutions, it changes the properties of that water. Things like the density, the boiling point, and the freezing point all change. The density also changes as whatever it is dissolved more. If it's a light thing, the density will decrease. If it's a heavy thing, the density will continue to rise. So salt water is 2 to 3 more times dense than fresh water because salt is a heavy molecule. All right, so we said that the solution that has something dissolved in it changes some properties like freezing point and boiling point. The boiling point of any liquid is the temperature at which a liquid turns to a gas. And this temperature increases as salt concentrations rise. That's why you put salt in your boiling pasta water, because then that water gets hotter to boil, and then it cooks the pasta faster. The freezing point is the exact opposite. It is the temperature at which a liquid turns to a solid. So this temperature, this freezing point, decreases when salt concentration rises. So as you add more salt to something, it freezes at lower temperatures. And this is what's happening in this picture here. We have applied salt to the sidewalk here. All of the water that was trapped in snow, its temperature decreased for its freezing point, and it turned into water and has run off. And this walkway is now usable. So that's kind of us manipulating the properties of water. Another thing we'll talk about is the solutions and their pH. As you get a whole bunch of salts in water, it can affect the pH of that liquid. So in our systems, we use what's called a buffer. But this is an aqueous solution that acts to stabilize the changes in pH. As you add more acid, it doesn't become super acidic. You have some bases in there that kind of neutralize it, and vice versa. As you add some base in, it's got some acid that neutralizes it. But buffering what it does is it creates livable conditions in both the body and the ocean that are resistant to changes in pH, so that all of our really sensitive organisms don't die because of the pH levels. All right, the next section here is on properties of ocean water. So we're going to take the same properties that water already has and just look at a little bit of how salt changes that. So the first thing is salinity, which is the measure of dissolved salts in water. So this is the ratio of salts per the mass of water. We determine salinity by running electric current through a water sample and seeing how much electric conductivity we have. The more salt, the more ions we should have, and therefore we should have more electrical currents produced when we run that electricity through it. And then another thing that we talk about is water masses. And these are just like, these are a body of water with distinct temperature and salinity. They're like air masses, but liquid. So in this picture, we've got anytime you see a different color here, these are different water masses. And like air, they have the potential to mix and cause some things going on down there. When we look at seawater, the salts that are dissolved inside of seawater form ions. Table salt is the biggest constituent of seawater. It has the positive sodium here and the negative chloride here. Sodium chloride is about 85% of the ocean saltwater contents. The others are things like magnesium and sulfates and calcium and potassium and phosphate. that kind of give up some extra chunks of here. But in all of this seawater here, we have just this tiny little amount, about 3.5%, that is these salts here. So even though it's a very small amount, it does have a big, profound impact. So the ocean is not all the same amount of salty. It varies from area to area in its salinity. Near the ocean floor, it's close to around 35%. Near the surface, it's 33% to 37% based on local conditions. And whenever we get runoff, like from a glacier or from a river, it's lower than that even, like 30%. So you can see here that this runoff here is not mixing right away from this fresh river. Lower near the equator, there's less salt, because of rainfall kind of dilutes that seawater, makes it less salty. Also, salinity changes over areas of temperature. So in areas that are extremely hot or extremely cold, the salinity is a little bit different. So hot, dry climates evaporate extra water, making these areas extra salty. So things like the Mediterranean and the Red Sea have salinities that are high as 40%, almost 10% more. Salt composition hasn't changed much in the last 200 million years, as far as we can tell based on geologic samples and ocean sediments and things like that. What happens is plants and animals take up salt and use it in their body just as fast as new salt is being dumped into the ocean from rivers and those kind of systems. So we're constantly cycling through that salt. So the temperature profile of the ocean, almost all the heat in the ocean comes from sunlight. So if you're up in the area where you get lots of sunlight, it is probably fairly warm. However, the heat and light don't penetrate very deep into the ocean. So as you decrease, the temperature goes down really, really fast. So after about 1,000 feet here, it gets pretty darn cold. So except for the surface water up here, most ocean water is just a few degrees above freezing. So pretty darn cold and dark. There are some temperature zones that we do separate the ocean into. We've got the surface zone, or the mixed layer, that is warmed by sunlight. We've got the middle zone, or the thermocline here, where we have little light penetrating, and then we have the deep zone, where there's no light and it's very, very cold. So temperature is really low here. It gets warmer in the middle zone, and then hottest in the surface zone. So the mixed layer, it heats pretty evenly, stays all the same temperature because wind and waves are mixing this zone constantly, recycling it and like stirring it up like a big soup. So this is it's less than 2% of Earth's ocean volume, even though it's a really large area. It doesn't have a lot of depth to it, but it is home to millions of tiny photosynthetic organisms, and it runs to about 50 meters at the pole to 100 meters deep at the equator. And there's a lot of oxygen there, and as you continue to move downward through these zones, you lose oxygen content. So at the top, a lot of oxygen content in the mixed layer. The middle layer is it's marked by a lot of transitions. So things are changing a lot here. There's a lot of rapid temperature change here happening. This line where it's like the temperature changing in this area is called the thermocline. And the water at the bottom of this area is very cold. Even at the equator, the temperature of this zone is only around 5 degrees Celsius. So not very summer vacationing. All right, and then below that we have the deep water. The polar water masses get the least amount of sunlight, and they get it really, really kind of at an angle, so it's not very much insulation. So these waters are cold from the top to the bottom. Cold water is denser than the other waters because of that density trick, so this water sinks to the bottom. And because of this, we find polar water beneath the ocean waters at almost all latitudes. So when you go out in the middle of the Pacific and you go down to the very, very bottom, it's probably got polar water that has kind of migrated there. The only place we don't see this are really shallow seas that don't have really good access to polar areas, like the Mediterranean, which is kind of tucked inside of between two continents, and so that stays a little bit warmer. All right, the last chunk of this chapter is about ocean life. We estimate that the ocean has 10 million species in it. And photosynthesis only happens in that mixed top layer. And usually it's happening from two kind of creatures, either phytoplankton, which are these guys up here, which are typically single-celled protists that float freely in the ocean's water. They use energy, they get their energy from light, and they turn it into sugar. And then we have diatoms, which are these one-celled phytoplankton protists here that have these thin shells made of calcium that come in various different sizes and shapes, and they're very cool to look at and like very cool, unique bunch. But these two organisms, kind of types of organisms, make up the base of the ocean food chain. So, phytoplankton survival. When we get lots of sunlight and lots of nutrients, their population explodes. These large concentrations can change the color of the water and are called blooms. You're seeing a bloom here. All of this green is phytoplankton that is just going to town. These can be visible from space, and they change color and are different colors based on the phytoplankton species involved. So usually there's some form of yellow, brown, or green though. The survival of these phytoplankton depends on a couple things. If they're getting fresh nutrients from ocean currents, if they're at the right temperature, and if they've got nutrient mass available. If they don't have nutrients available, they will starve and die. Kind of the same as any other organism. So the effects of these guys, most organisms in the ocean rely on them for food. They use carbon dioxide in photosynthesis and release oxygen that is breathable to animals, so they are nice little oxygen pumps. And when they die, their little microscopic shells here settle to the seafloor and become part of the sediment, and they add to that sediment over time. You're seeing here is like a blown up microscopic view of some ocean sediment. It's got lots of these little guys hanging out in it. All right, the next one is zooplankton or zooplankton, depending on where you are in the world. And these microscopic or animals that drift in the ocean water and eat phytoplankton are other small zooplankton, and they're here on this food chain. Phytoplankton is the first one. They're very diverse. There are a lot of different things. There are things like small crustaceans. There are things like immature forms of larger animals like squid and crab and jellyfish larvae. But they help moderate salinity of the ocean water by taking in salt and minerals and making their hard shells with it. So they take in a lot of calcium and other kind of things. The next important organism is coral, and these are tiny sea animals. Coral is an animal that lives in colonies attached to rocky floors. They can also, when you say coral, you can also refer to the skeletal remains of that same animal, but they live in waters between 18 and 21 degrees Celsius, and they don't live any deeper than 90 meters. But large buildup of these guys, like this picture here, makes what we call coral reefs. And these structures provide food and shelter to many organisms, and most organisms that live here have some kind of mutualistic or symbiotic relationship with the coral reef itself. Our next kind of chunk here is nekton, and nekton is a broad term, just like plankton is. That means the free-swimming organisms like fish and reptiles and whales and squid and jellyfish. So these aren't like how they're classified together as like biologically, but where they are and what role they fill. So the areas that these live depend on the temperature, salinity, and nutrients available. They mostly live in the mixed layer, but may be found elsewhere and maybe go between the layers. They may swim up and down depending on their life cycles. But 1 billion people each year rely on fish for their diet. So it is important. We got 8 billion people. 1 billion of them are eating mostly fish. So this nekton population is very important. Going deeper, we have deep sea life, and we have a whole bunch of weird, wacky creatures that live down here. There's not a lot of oxygen down here. The oxygen that is down here is coming from the dense, cold polar regions. So we get a lot of carbon dioxide accumulation down here because we don't have any oxygen production, and that carbon dioxide gets trapped inside of these kind of ocean currents. When Alvin was down and about, he found many organisms down here that don't use sunlight to create energy. They eat other things in the food chain, and they get all of their energy from ocean floor vents. These ocean floor vents, there's two types of them. There's cracks in the seafloor that release hot water around 16 degrees Celsius, which is really warm compared to the 4 degrees Celsius that this area normally is. But they also have these what we call smokers, and they spew water about 380 degrees Celsius, very, very, very hot, from volcano-like chimneys. This hot material dissolves minerals as it comes through and deposits these minerals on the seafloor around these vents. These smokers produce a gas called hydrogen sulfide, which is crucial to life down here at this depth. Certain bacteria live on these chemoautotrophic bacteria live on these. They use this process called chemosynthesis, where they take inorganic molecules like hydrogen sulfide and use it for energy versus having photosynthesis. But these guys are eaten by other organisms, which feed barnacles, they feed giant clams, this carnivorous shrimp, anemones, and a lot of unique animals that live around these kind of vent systems. This is the conclusion of chapter 22. I hope that you learned a lot and that you kind of get a better view of why the ocean is important. It's going to be in the kind of the focus of the next couple chapters. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, let me know, and we'll see you in the next one.